Have you ever wondered how long it takes for a scar to stop aching? A month, a year, or an entire lifetime? And what happens when two souls, each carrying their own invisible scars, happen to meet in a vast land of sun, wind, and silence? Our story today begins not with a gunshot, but with a knock on the door. A timid yet determined knock that echoed across a desolate ranch under the big sky of Wyoming in the late 1880s. It was a sound that changed everything, like the first brave seed cracking through the dry, hardened earth. The August sun hung low over the hills, painting the landscape in a faded gold of honey and dust. The wind blew relentlessly, carrying the dryness of summer as it caressed the tawny blades of grass. Elias Thorne's ranch was nestled in the valley, as quiet as a forgotten stone. The wooden house, the barn, and the surrounding fence were all stained with the color of time and an unspoken sorrow. Inside the house, the silence was even thicker. It had been 3 years since the fever took Sarah, Elias's wife, and their young son, Leo. Since that day, time inside the house seemed to have frozen. On the windowsill, Sarah's geraniums had long since withered, their brittle leaves ready to crumble at the slightest touch of a careless wind. In the kitchen, the kettle wore a fine layer of dust, the hearth was cold, and the pots hanging on the wall seemed to have forgotten the warmth of a fire. Elias lived like a shadow in his own home. He worked from before sunrise until the night stars filled the sky. He mended fences, tended to his small flock of sheep, chopped wood, all the necessary tasks for survival. His hands were calloused and rough, more accustomed to holding a hammer or an axe than to gentle gestures. He spoke so little that the townsfolk nearby sometimes forgot the sound of his voice. To them, Elias Thorne was simply a man, silenced by grief. And then, one evening at dusk, the knock came. Elias was sitting on his porch, his gaze lost on the horizon. He hadn't had a visitor in a very long time. He thought he had misheard, perhaps just the sound of a dry branch breaking. But then the knock came again, softer, but clear. He rose slowly, his body stiff from labor and loneliness. When the door creaked open, he saw a young woman standing there. She looked to be about 20, as thin as a willow branch, her honey-colored hair tangled by wind and dust. The dress she wore was faded, and her boots were nearly worn through. But what caught Elias's attention was not her ragged appearance, but her eyes. They were a clear green, yet held a deep weariness, and a determination that could not be easily extinguished. In her hands, she clutched an old cast-iron pot, as if it were her only treasure. She did not beg, nor did she cry. She looked directly into Elias's eyes, her voice trembling slightly, but clear. "Mister," she said, "I don't talk much, but I can cook." It was not a plea. It was a promise. A silent promise of warmth, of hot meals, of a life that could be rekindled from the simplest things. Elias looked at her for a long moment. He looked down at her hands gripping the pot's handle, her fingers slender but strong. He looked past her shoulder, down the dusty red road. No wagon, no companion. Just her, and the cast-iron pot. For a fleeting moment, he saw a reflection of himself in the strange girl's eyes, an ultimate solitude. He didn't ask her name, nor where she came from. His silence was accustomed to foregoing explanations. He simply stepped aside, holding the door wide open. "You're hired," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. Then he added, almost in a whisper to himself, "And you're home." The young woman's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but as if she had just set down a burden she had carried for too long. She stepped over the threshold, her bare feet hesitant on the wooden floor. She didn't dare look around, keeping her head bowed as she silently followed Elias's gesture, toward a small room at the back of the house. That night, Elias didn't lock the door. And for the first time in 3 years, a thin, gentle wisp of smoke rose from the chimney of the house, carrying the scent of bread and stewed vegetables into the silent Wyoming night. The room Elias gave her was small and clean, but cold. There was a single bed with a neatly folded woolen blanket, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the prairie. The girl, whom Elias would later learn was named Martha, touched nothing, except to place her cast iron pot beside the bed. The next morning, when Elias entered the kitchen, he stopped at the threshold. A subtle, yet powerful change had occurred. Martha had been there since before dawn. She had scrubbed the stovetop clean, and rearranged the pots that had long been cold. The window was open, letting in the morning light and fresh air, chasing away the musty smell of neglect. And most importantly, the fire in the hearth had been lit. The logs crackled, radiating a gentle warmth the house had not felt in a very long time. Martha stood with her back to him, her hands deftly kneading dough. She said nothing, and neither did Elias. He just sat down quietly at the familiar dining table, where he had eaten 1,001 meals alone. This time, a clean porcelain plate and a cup were waiting for him. A little while later, Martha placed a plate of hot biscuits and a glass of fresh milk in front of him. The biscuits weren't fancy, just simple flour biscuits, but they exuded a rich aroma, the smell of care, the smell of a home. Elias picked one up. The heat seeped through his calloused fingers. He took a bite. The gentle sweetness of the flour, the richness of the butter, and the warmth of the fresh-baked biscuit seemed to melt a block of ice that had been lodged in his chest. He didn't look up, but he knew Martha was watching him, not with curiosity, but with anticipation. "Good," was the only word he said. A faint smile brushed Martha's lips, as fleeting as a sunbeam. The following days fell into a new rhythm. Martha did more than just cook. She brought life back to every corner of the house. She washed the dusty curtains, allowing the light to pour in more brightly. She planted some basil and rosemary in old wooden boxes by the kitchen window. She found Sarah's books, dusted them carefully, and arranged them neatly back on the shelf. She did all of this quietly, never intruding on Elias's personal space, but her presence, like the fire in the hearth, silently spread its warmth. Elias remained a man of few words. But he began to notice the little things. He noticed the scent of rosemary in his morning eggs. He saw the tiny wildflowers arranged in an old jar on the dining table. One afternoon, he came back to find Sarah's armchair, one of its legs broken, propped up carefully, though it was still wobbly. The next day, Martha saw Elias in the barn, a piece of oak and his carving tools in hand. He said nothing, just worked diligently. By evening, as she was cleaning the kitchen, she saw the armchair had been fixed. The new leg was exquisitely carved, a perfect fit. It was his way of saying, "Thank you." One night, a thunderstorm rolled in. Lightning tore across the sky, and rain lashed against the windows like a whip. Martha was sitting by the fire, mending her worn dress. With every loud clap of thunder, her shoulders jumped, and her hands trembled. Memories flooded back. The image of her drunken father, the sound of shouting, of things being smashed, and the feeling of helplessness as she hid in a closet, clutching her mother's cast iron pot like a shield. She had run away from that house, from the rough hands and cruel words. She had walked hundreds of miles, taken on heavy work, endured prying eyes and indecent proposals, all to find a place where she could breathe. Elias entered the room, holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He placed one in Martha's hands. Chamomile tea, its gentle scent filled the air. "Raining hard," he said, an obvious statement, but it broke the tense silence. Martha nodded, her lips moving but no words came out. Elias sat in the opposite chair, not looking at her, just at the fire. Sarah was afraid of thunder, too, he said softly. She said it sounded like the sky was angry. But I told her, after its anger, the sky cries. And after it cries, it becomes clearer than ever before. He didn't ask about Martha's past. But by sharing a piece of his own pain, he showed her that he understood. He understood the invisible scars she carried. Martha looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time, she felt she was more than just a hired hand. She felt seen. That night, when the storm passed, she slept deeply, free from nightmares. And Elias, after making sure the fire in the hearth was still burning steadily, returned to his room, and for the first time in 3 years, he dreamt of Sarah smiling at him, under a clear blue sky. Autumn arrived, bringing a crisp chill to the air and a cascade of falling yellow leaves. Elias's ranch had transformed. It no longer looked desolate and grim. The fences were mended, the barn was clean, and Martha's small garden was green with the last vegetables of the season. Life had returned, not with a clamor, but with quiet persistence. This change was noticed by more than just those on the ranch. One morning, as Elias and Martha were repairing the porch roof together, a fancy carriage stopped at the gate. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out. He had Elias's features, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. It was Caleb Thorne, Elias's younger brother. Caleb had never liked the ranch life. He had left home early for the city, making his fortune through shrewd business and questionable deals. He had only returned upon hearing of Sarah's death, not to offer condolences, but to see what he could gain from his brother's sorrow. "Brother," Caleb said mockingly, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a look of appraisal. "This place looks less pathetic than I imagined. Must be the new help." His gaze landed on Martha, a condescending and invasive look that made her uncomfortable. She took a step back, positioning herself behind Elias. Elias put down his hammer, his tall frame becoming a sturdy shield. "What are you doing here, Caleb? Can't a man visit his own brother?" Caleb sneered. "I heard you were letting this place go to ruin, so I came to see if you needed help. For instance, selling it, and moving somewhere more civilized." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You can't live in the past forever, Elias. Sarah and the boy are gone. This land needs an owner with a sharp mind, not one who just wallows in grief." "This is my home," Elias replied, his voice low and firm. "And I'm not going anywhere." "Is that so?" Caleb raised an eyebrow, then looked at Martha again. "And what about her? What are you paying her with? Old memories? Or do you plan to let this young woman bury her youth in this godforsaken place?" Martha clenched her fists. Caleb's words were like needles piercing her old wounds, reminding her of being looked down upon, of being valued like a commodity. Before she could react, Elias spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was full of authority. "She is not the help. Her name is Martha. And she is part of this home. You have no right to speak of her that way." Caleb was stunned. He had never seen his brother stand up for anyone, or anything, since the tragedy. A flicker of anger flashed in his eyes. "Oh, I see. Part of the home," he repeated, his tone dripping with ridicule. "We'll see how long this home of yours stands." With that, Caleb turned, climbed back into his carriage, and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering threat in the air. After Caleb left, silence fell. Martha looked at Elias, her heart in turmoil. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Because of me, you had to. It's not your fault, Elias interrupted, his voice softening. He turned back and picked up his hammer. Caleb has always been this way. He only sees the value of land, not the value of a home. But the incident had stirred something within Elias. He realized that his silence and withdrawal not only harmed himself, but could also expose those he cared about to harm. He couldn't let Caleb destroy the fragile peace that Martha had brought. In the following days, the sound of Elias's hammer echoed more frequently. He wasn't just repairing, he was building. He built a new, stronger fence around Martha's garden. He built a long bench, so they could sit together on the porch and watch the sunset. Each hammer blow was not just to join pieces of wood, but an affirmation of his resolve to protect what he held dear. Martha understood. She was no longer the timid, fearful girl from the first day. Elias's protection had given her strength. She began to smile more. She hummed her mother's quiet lullabies while baking. One day, she boldly asked to borrow some of Elias's smaller carving tools. That evening, she presented him with a small wooden spoon she had carved herself. It was clumsy, but filled with gratitude. They didn't speak of love. They made no promises. But through these small actions, through the echoing hammer and the smell of new wood, through the scent of baked goods and quiet smiles, they were building not just a house, but a fortress against the ghosts of the past, and the injustices of the present. Winter descended, bringing with it biting winds and a blanket of white snow. Elias's ranch became a warm oasis in the vast, snowy expanse. But that peace was not to last. Caleb Thorne had not given up. He returned, and this time, he was not alone. With him were the town lawyer, and two large, brutish-looking men. They stopped their carriage right in the yard, and walked straight into the house without bothering to knock. At that moment, Elias and Martha were in the kitchen, wrapping meat pies for the winter. The warmth from the hearth and the aroma of food made the air cozy, a stark contrast to the icy chill brought by the uninvited guests. Elias, Caleb announced, waving a piece of paper. I've spoken with the judge. He agrees that you are no longer mentally competent to manage this property. The papers are here. You have 2 weeks to pack your things and leave. Elias stood still, his face emotionless, but his eyes darkened. This was our parents' land. You have no right? Right? Caleb laughed loudly. Rights belong to the strong, the clever, Elias. Not to someone who spends his days talking to ghosts. And as for her, he jerked his chin toward Martha, she'd better pack her bags too. This town doesn't welcome vagrants of unknown origin. Caleb's words were a slap in the face to Martha. She froze, the familiar feeling of fear beginning to creep in. Run. The instinct screamed at her. Run, just like you've done so many times before. But then, she looked at Elias. She saw his hand clench into a fist, his knuckles turning white. She saw the conflict in his eyes, a battle between his familiar grief and the newly kindled flame of anger. And she knew, this time she couldn't run. To flee would mean abandoning the only person who had ever shown her kindness, the only person who had given her a home. Just then, Elias took a step forward, placing himself in front of Martha. He didn't look at Caleb, but straight at the lawyer. Mr. Miller, Elias said, his voice deep and clear, echoing through the kitchen. You are a man of the law. You know our father's will. This land belongs to me as long as I live on it, and work it. I suggest you look around. The fire is burning. Bread is baking. The fences are mended. This is not the home of a madman. This is a home that is alive. Then he turned to Caleb, his eyes blazing with a fire Caleb had never seen. You may have money, you may have influence, but you don't have this. He gestured with his hand, not touching Martha, but indicating her, the hearth, the entire warm kitchen. You don't have a home. You can force me out, but you will never find peace here. Because this land does not tolerate evil. It was the climax of the battle. Not with guns, but with words, with truth. The external action, the confrontation with Caleb, had forced Elias to face his own internal climax. He had to choose between remaining submerged in the past, or standing up to protect his present and future. Caleb and the lawyer were stunned by Elias's transformation. But Martha was not. She stepped forward to stand beside him, her eyes no longer fearful, but shining with resolve. I am not going anywhere, she said, her voice clear and strong. This is my home. At that very moment, the door opened again. Mr. Hank, their closest neighbor, and his wife, Clara, entered. They had seen Caleb's carriage and sensed trouble. They had witnessed the ranch's transformation over the past months, and had received the warm pies Martha had brought over. Is there a problem, Elias? Mr. Hank asked, a sturdy wooden staff in his hand. Seeing the neighbors, seeing this unexpected solidarity, the lawyer began to falter. He knew he couldn't fight the opinion of an entire small community. Caleb was furious, his face red, but he knew he had lost. You'll regret this, he hissed, before storming out with his men. When they were gone, silence returned. Clara walked over and embraced Martha. You did well, dear. Elias looked at Martha, and in that moment, all the icy walls around his heart seemed to melt away. He reached out his hand, and this time, he took hers. His hand was rough, but incredibly warm. Outside, the snowstorm began to subside. The first weak rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a silvery sheen on the ground. The storm had passed, both outside and within. They had faced it together, and won. They had chosen to stay. The dawn after a storm is always the most beautiful. The sky was crystal clear, without a single cloud. Every snowflake sparkled under the morning sun, like millions of diamonds scattered across the valley. The air was cold and sharp, but carried an extraordinary freshness. In the kitchen of the Thorne Ranch, the fire still burned steadily in the hearth. The smell of coffee and toasted bread filled the air, warm and familiar. Elias and Martha sat opposite each other at the wooden table, in silence. But this silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, and full of things that didn't need to be said. Elias handed Martha a ceramic mug, steam rising from its rim. Thank you, he said softly. Martha smiled, a truly radiant smile. You too, Elias. Thank you for not giving up. They needed to say no more. They had weathered the storm together, had stood firm together. That was a commitment stronger than any spoken vow. Life on the ranch returned to its simple rhythm. But everything was different. Elias's sorrow hadn't vanished completely. It was like a healed scar that still ached on cold days, but it no longer controlled him. He began to talk more, sometimes telling Martha about Leo's mischievous adventures, or about how Sarah had chosen which flowers to plant by the window. Sharing didn't make the pain bigger, it made the memory sweeter. Martha, too, had found her place. She was no longer the girl on the run. She was the keeper of the home, the one who brought laughter back into the house. She taught Elias how to garden, and he, in turn, taught her how to distinguish different types of wood, how to hold a chisel to create soft lines on an inanimate object. One spring afternoon, as the first green shoots pushed through the damp earth, Elias led Martha out onto the porch. He handed her a small wooden box he had made himself. She opened it. Inside was a comb made of apple wood, carved with tiny, intricate geraniums. It was exquisite and beautiful, and she knew he had poured a great deal of time and heart into it. Sarah would have liked you, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. She always said a house needs a woman's laughter, and the smell of baking bread. Martha looked up at him, her eyes glistening. She said nothing, just gently placed her hand on his. They stood there, together, watching the sun set behind the hills. The ranch was no longer a place of solitude and loss. It had become a place of healing, of new beginnings. It was a testament to the fact that family is not always made of blood, but is sometimes built from empathy, courage, and the choice to stay together when the storm comes. And the answer to the initial question, how long does it take for a scar to stop aching? Perhaps, it never truly disappears. But when there is another hand, warm enough to hold, gentle enough to soothe, that scar is no longer a source of pain. It becomes part of the story, a reminder of the resilience of life, of the human capacity to heal, and of the love that can be found in the most unexpected of places, even amidst the dust and silence of the wild, untamed West.